right, so let's get started. I'm Ben Hughes. I moved to San Diego recently. I do freelancing. And I'm going to talk today about active record model refactoring. And kind of the inspiration from this talk came from two projects I did recently for clients. And they both were kind of refactoring jobs on existing code bases. And one was a sort of social application with about 75 models. And the larger one was a CRM system with about 100 models. And so I did a lot of refactoring of both controllers and the models and built out a test suite. And I learned quite a bit from going through that process in both these applications. So kind of jotted down some techniques I used and thought I'd present them today. So first of all, your model layer is very important. I'd say it's probably the most important part of your application to keep nice and clean and well factored. And I don't think that best practices are talked about too much in the model layer. I mean, most people understand Active Record really well and all the features, but there's a lot of stuff you can do with those features. And I think best practices are something that really interests me, at least. So some of the sort of subtopics I'm going to cover are these. And they're not necessarily 100% related to refactoring, but all of them are sort of best practices I feel pretty strongly about. And so I'll start out talking about some style organization issues, model naming, then talk a bit about breaking up models that get to be too large, making them more modular, finding instances in your models where you're repeating things, so making them dry, extracting that to a module. And the fourth one is a weird name. I wasn't real sure what to call this, but de-normalization patterns are sort of ways to interact with your model that's more flat than what the underlying table structure might actually be. And so there's a couple of techniques I used in those two projects to do that. And then I'll talk about a little bit about callbacks validations, which I think are sometimes overused and misused. And then finally, some issues with security and some gotchas that people seem to run into a lot. And definitely a lot of stuff discussed here are opinions. I mean, this isn't the one true way of doing things. I'd love to hear from you about the ways you approach these issues. I'm really interested in how people approach other things. So definitely if there's something you disagree with, or maybe you have a tip or something, see me after the meeting. I'd love to talk about it. So jumping right into organization and style, model naming, I think, is a topic that isn't talked about too much, but is very important. It's also one of those things that people tend to kind of be stuck with after they choose model name. You choose a name, then you build out the controllers and views, and everything kind of relies on that. And it can be difficult to change that down the line, so you end up being stuck with it, more or less. But I'd say that the one big thing about model naming that I tried to do is to always name models such that they are pluralizable nouns. So, and just some examples of this are, for example, that second one, order history. So you should always ask yourself when you come up with a name, can this be pluralized? Does it make sense in both singular and plural? And I don't think order history really does. So you can talk about an order history and then multiple order histories. It sounds kind of weird, not real sure about that. So I would call something like that maybe an order log entry. And so that's clearly, you can pluralize that and it makes sense. And then the third example, address book. So address book is a pluralizable noun. You can have an address book and address books, but you have to be careful with meaning with stuff like that because it depends what you're really representing. And in the one app I was working on, they had address book, but it really represented an entry in an address book. So talking about them in terms of address books was kind of wrong, and so it should have been named address book entry. There's also a trade-off between maintaining context with names and brevity. And this is something I struggle with a lot. I think a lot of other people run into this issue. Say you're building a product catalog. Do you name your category just category or product category or what, right? So product category has a little more context, but it's a little more verbose. And these issues kind of depend on what you think you're going to have aside from these. So I think, for example, group is a little too generic. So if I have an employee group, I'd probably name it employee group. Because who knows, there could be some other feature in the app that is group related, and that could cause confusion. So there's kind of a balance of trying to be concise, yet still have enough context for it to make sense. Related to that, naming join models. So this is where you have two models, and then essentially many-to-many relationship between them has many through. And I see quite often people will name that join model something, something along the lines of product category. So they'll just take the two model names and put them together. And with has and belongs to many, that's kind of the default in Rails for table naming. But I think that's kind of bad because, as you can see in that example, if you name that product category, it's not clear that that's an actual assignment. It's not clear that's a join table. So that could mean, I look at that and I see that means a category, and product is just part of the context for that. So it's a little confusing to name something like that. And I always prefer to make it explicit as a suffix, it being an assignment or a member or something along those lines. And then similarly for product bundles, I would call that join model product bundle member. A related issue to model naming is resource naming on the controller side. Typically speaking, they're synonymous. I mean, normally you name your resources what you name your models. There's some exceptions. There's some weird issues that I've encountered from these exceptions. So say you have this simple example where you have customers and a sub-resource of locations. Pretty simple. Now, there's sort of an interesting problem here that I've run into a lot. So if you have a controller called locations controller, but you name your model customer location to maintain that context, maybe you won't, but let's just say you do. What happens is that you might name your instance variable location, and your resource for that is name location. But what happens when you go and you try to use like a URL for, like a form for in your form, right? So most people would use that, like customer location, and that doesn't really work. So because what Rails will interpret that to mean is customer location. It's repeating that from the model name, and that doesn't match up with your resource naming your routes. So I've run into this issue a lot, and I think a lot of people, when they encounter this, they kind of say, okay, well, I'll manually specify it with URL in the form. So you can always manually do that. And I don't like that solution. It's not consistent with the rest of the forms. It's not consistent with what I like to do. I like to use the polymorphic path solution. And I found it kind of an interesting way to get around this problem, and it involves overriding the model name. So when Rails will try to determine that path for you, it actually doesn't consult the class name directly. It consults this model name, which is defaults to the class name. And you can override that to make it work really nicely with your resources if there's a discrepancy. So in this example, we could take customer location, override the model name, and just call it location. And so once you do that, that URL for works perfectly. And in another slide, I'm going to show an example using this with namespace models. It also solves a similar problem. So attribute naming, a lot of this I think is debatable. These are my personal preferences. I always try to name models such that the humanized output looks decent, right? So, for example, I try to use underscores, which will create a space when you humanize it. If you're using internationalization, this is less of an issue because you're defining that anyways. But and also in the third example, I try to, along the same lines, use if I have something like address 2, where there's a number suffix, I put an underscore in front of that 2, because that will create the space that I want. So I always try to think about humanize when I name attributes. And the fourth point is kind of a pet peeve of mine. I see this a lot, but I think we should try not to name attributes things that get confused with foreign keys, right? So you might have, let's say you have a transactions table representing authorized.net transactions. And what comes back from you from authorized.net is a transaction ID, right? And I don't like naming that transaction ID because that implies a foreign key to something in your database, right? So you just look at that table, it looks like that's a foreign key when it's really not. So I try to avoid those situations, and I'll just name it something like reference or code instead, so it's not confused with a foreign key. And finally, in a lot of apps, you have models that have a similar sort of parallel attributes, right? I mean, a lot of models have something along the lines of name or title, product, category, whatever. And I don't have a preference as to what you call it, name or title, but I think it should be consistent. Try to be consistent with it. So if you have a category that has a name, you might want to consider when you do the product model also calling that a name, just to be consistent. Association naming is related also, and of course there's a lot of different ways to approach this, and kind of the default approach, at least the default way Rails will interpret the association, is to just use the full name. So in this example, you have a customer location, and so the reverse side of the association would be customer has many customer locations, because that's the model, is customer location. I try to avoid this because that creates, when you use your models, now you have to do customer.customer locations, and that's repeating context. So you obviously already have that context from having the customer object. And so I'd rather just do customer.locations. Even if there's a location model elsewhere in your app, this is very clear. The context is clear, just doing customer.locations. So I'll try to chop off that context in the front, even if the model is named that way. And then the only thing is, when you do so, you have to give Rails a class name, because it won't be able to determine that, and possibly a foreign key, depending on how you do it. I tend to define two methods for almost every model. Well, really one. The first one I think is important. Defining a string representation of model is really important. It makes for your views can be a lot more succinct, because you can just output, the object, and not worry about calling a certain attribute. It also kind of escapes the problem I talked about earlier, is how you name that, right? So it doesn't matter now. You don't need to know even what it is. You just have a string representation of it. And secondly, the two-param is used commonly, because it's sort of a nice little technique in Rails for generating the URLs. You can give it kind of a nice slugified URL, as long as you start it with the ID. Because the define method in ActiveRecord will do a to IM that, so it'll just use the integer portion at the beginning. Another thing that's worthwhile is trying to be consistent with order of declaration of models. So we've got a lot of things in models going on. This is the order I use personally for the most part. I don't think one way is better than another. I just think being consistent is important between your models, especially if they get to be a little large. It helps finding things. And you work with other developers, of course. Some of them might have different preferences, so not sure what to do about that. But OK, so now on a little bit to modularity and breaking down your models that might be too large. And a lot of apps that you develop, you're building up features rapidly, and some models end up being really large and bloated. And especially with, associations usually aren't that bad, but instance methods, you're doing all this stuff, all these instance methods, and it's kind of hard to organize them there. It's hard to find things. And so a method I've been starting to use quite a bit is actually breaking up these individual models into modules that are specific to that class. So say you have an order and you've got a lot of stuff related to workflow, like a state machine maybe. And you might also have some payment processing related stuff in with that order. So I would break this up into two different modules, and then you can just include that in the class. And there's two ways of doing this. This is the first way, and this is just a straight up flat namespace, where you might just start it with order and call workflow. Technique I've actually prefer, it works really well, is creating that module within that class namespace, so using that class name as a namespace. And it turns out this works great with Rails, because the class loader will automatically descend the directory to find your module. So if I have an order, I just create a subdirectory of that model. It's called order. And then in there, I can put modules. And then it's just namespace, just like that. And then you can just include them like so. And this has another little benefit that I found is it segments your test also. So I can create separate specs for the state machine related stuff in my order and the payment related stuff. And the described class is still order, but I add a little context there. And it maps really nicely. It also ends up being an alternate file in your editor, so it works really well. Now, in terms of writing the actual modules, I didn't show the module body in the previous slide, but there's two approaches for doing this. This is sort of the traditional idiom in Ruby for writing a module that gets included somewhere. So with this, you make use of the included hook on module, and then you extend it with the class methods submodule and instance methods module for instance methods. And then you can class eval certain code that needs to get run in class context. So this is the traditional way. I mean, it works fine. It's great. There's a newer and better way using active support concern, which abstracts this common idiom for you. And with this, you just include active support concern, and then you still have the class methods, instance methods, but you can call this included method, and then that will class eval stuff. And this is more succinct, but there's actually some other benefits of using this. It solves some kind of edge case scenarios that don't work in the previous scenario. So you should try to use active support concern in Rails 3 if you're able to. Another mechanism to break up your models, and this I think is mostly used, at least for me, I've used it in breaking up models that might connect to different databases. So in your app, you might have standard models that are part of your application database, but you might have this subsection models that connect to somewhere else. And some people don't know that you can create module namespaces for your models. And in fact, you don't actually have to define the module. Rails will kind of spawn it into being if you have a subdirectory of that models. So in here, we might have a namespace called enterprise. And then we can just have within, as a subdirectory of that models, our namespace models in there. And a technique that I try to use whenever I do this is, rather than extending those namespace models from ActiveRecord base, create a base class in that namespace, which extends ActiveRecord base. And in doing so, you can establish a connection to another database easily for all those models. And then you see the model name thing there from before. So the problem with namespacing is that you'll run into the same issue with that polymorphic path, is that Rails will try to put that namespace for all your models, which probably isn't what you want. So you can define the model name there, and that will just use the last portion of it, and it will mostly work how you want. And finally, if you do this, be sure to define it as an abstract class, because without doing this, Rails will take this to mean it's an STI base class. Certainly, you're not doing single table inheritance here. You're doing a proper subclass. So don't forget that. And if you have any common functionality among models, certainly that's another opportunity for creating modules that are shared between your classes. So, for example, if I have something that's votable and that has a polymorphic association, I might extract that to a module if there's some instance methods that get shared there. You can put this right in your app models directory and just include it in your models, and you can use the self-included hook or the active support concern I showed earlier. Now, in terms of just bread and butter refactoring of models, this is probably the most important thing. This is what I did a lot of in those two projects. Try to use small methods. I mean, this is a Ruby thing in general, but I think it's especially important in models. And if you do create the small methods, try to make them have verbose names. And when you bring this up, most people say the reason they do this is that it's easier to test. It's more granular, right? Which, that's a benefit. But I think a big thing is that it really increases self-documentation of the code. Because if you have this big method and there's all this stuff going on, the mere fact of taking a block of that code and refactoring it to be a separate method makes it documented in the fact that you now have a method name for that, especially if it's a verbose method name, like in this example. Another technique with models is that I see this is more just the fat model skinny controller concept, where you want to try to really make your models work for you and put things in there that you know are going to be useful. So rather than checking in, for example, your controller, maybe the individual attributes, try to create methods that abstract common things you might want to do. So this is basic stuff, but it's much easier to just call article.published and then knowing the logic of this. And it really belongs here. I mean, this is model layer functionality. This is a feature of Rails that doesn't get used too often, and I don't use it that much myself either, but it can be useful, composed of. You know, you can go read about this, but basically this allows you to take a subset of attributes in your model and represent them with a class. So in this example, you can have a customer, and then you can just call a customer to address, and that will be an instance of that address class, even though it's really operating essentially on those attributes on the customer model. Now, a little bit about callbacks. I think callbacks are kind of dangerous. I think in general, people kind of overuse them, and this is certainly debatable. I've seen people argue the other way very powerfully. But I think a lot of people, when they approach callbacks and models, is they build their model with sort of the use case that's front and center in their mind. So they know what the interface is going to be. They know how this model is supposed to work, and they're thinking, OK, if that model's sitting in controller, I got to push all the stuff to the model. Let's make it all callbacks, right? And that might be useful in that single scenario that you initially thought of for the model, but you have to be careful, because you should try to make your models usable in all sorts of scenarios. I mean, you don't want to constrict use of your model to this one thing. And the reason why this is important is that it's not easy to just disable callbacks. You know, unlike validation, you know, you can skip validation if you want. You can disable callbacks. There's kind of some hackish approaches to doing that. But so if you define a callback, before save callback on your model, and if you don't want to run that in some specific instance, it's kind of hard not to. So you want to be real careful with callbacks. You can conditionally run them. It's a technique I'm going to show after this. I don't really like doing that unless I absolutely have to. But so you can do that if you want to escape them being run. And finally, this is another point that's debated back and forth, sending emails and callbacks. So if you have a user model and you're sending a thank you email or whatever, I really try to avoid ever doing that in a callback, even though it seems to be done a lot. And sort of on a philosophical level, I don't think that's model level functionality. I think, you know, I mean, even in the new action mailer, it's more controller view oriented to invoke that even. But one issue that comes up with this a lot is that some people will create these before filters to send email in a user, for example, and then they'll think of another use case for users, like maybe an importer. So they create an importer for users. Well, what happens now? Now you're kind of stuck with your model sending this email out. And in your importer, you don't want to do that. You just want to get the data in. And now you can't even use your model without having this being run. So, you know, again, just think real hard about using callbacks and making sure that this really makes sense in the model to be run at all times. It's not a bad thing at all to call things from the controller other than .save, right? So if you do need to do things conditionally, this is one technique. Like I said, I don't like doing this. It feels not very clean to me, but it is possible to do. An example of validations, if you want some validations to sort of not be run in certain contexts, I've taken to creating an adder accessor and just setting that in the controller when you have a certain condition, you know, under which you're saving the model. So in this example, maybe you don't want to validate sitting in biography if you're an admin or something. So you can do this. You know, all the validations have an unless and then an if and the options to escape them. And this shows another little technique that is cool and I use a lot with options. So, and this actually is an ActiveRecord. This is active support, can be used all over. But with options, we'll let you define some default hash options for methods that accept an options hash at the end. So here, you know, we don't have to define unless managing for every one of those. And I think more importantly, it just kind of groups things really nicely into a block. So a similar technique for callback instead of validations is you can do the same thing, have the adder accessor, and then in your callback just wrap that around an unless or an if to escape doing so. And so if you really have callbacks on your model, but you want to not do them when you're importing, so you can just set importing to true, and then it won't run them. Another technique for doing this that might be a little cleaner, rather than setting the temporary variable, is sort of doing it in block form. So, you know, say you can create that importable module, right? and then that would set importing to true. It would yield itself, and then unset it, right? And then to use that, you can just do customer.importing and then give it a block that saves the model. So that kind of lets you have block context of what you're disabling for that particular save invocation. So now a bit about these de-normalization patterns. And so again, what I mean by that are things that allow you to use your models in more of a succinct way than perhaps dealing with underlying table structure. So you might have this pretty advanced, really heavily normalized set of tables, and there's sort of a one-to-one mapping between that usually in models, and it might be kind of quirky to work with. So here's some patterns to make it a little easier. The simplest one, this is real simple, is delegation. So you can delegate something to another object. So in this example, if we have order as many items, has many details, from the detail, if you delegate order to order item, it's just a little nicer. You don't have to traverse that association. Might be something you commonly want to do. Another technique that comes up a lot is if you have a model with a has many, and you usually want to create an initial record off that has many when you save the model. And this comes up with things a lot like maybe a ticketing system where it has many comments or log entries, where you create the ticket, but you also create an initial entry with it. So you can create a virtual attribute essentially called initial comment, and then before you create, you actually build that out. So when you're using this model, you don't have to worry about necessarily in that controller the fact that this comments exist. You can sort of treat that as a regular attribute, even though on the back end, it's really creating out the comment behind the scenes. And a more full-featured example of doing something similar is nested attributes that Rails provides now. This is really cool. I mean, when it came out, I thought it was awesome. Also have to be careful about it, so I'll get to that in the security section. But essentially, this lets you manage has many, has one associations with nested hashes. So here, if I have a bundle, I can create products along with it using nested attributes. And by the way, this also works nested. So you can create, if my product also had a nested attributes of something else, it will work 3 levels deep. It gets confusing, but it will work. So another technique for denormalization in your models is sort of creating a virtual attribute for that is intended to be an array. So say you have a model and you have multiple, has many association. And you don't really want to deal with that has many association. It might be really simple. And here, this example, contact might just have a single email address column, for example. And it just makes sense to treat that as an array on your object. And so you can do that with a virtual accessor. So in this example, contact emails, the setter there, all it's going to do is set an instance variable. And then up here, if you're trying to get it, it's going to either return that or actually grab the emails. And then finally, if you had set that manually to an array, it'll go through and it'll build them out for you, and then remove the ones that were not part of that array. So again, it just makes it easier to work with. Perhaps you don't want to deal with contacts. Here is a more complex example of something similar. So let me explain the business case behind this. So in this example, I was building out order system that had order has many order items. And then there's this third level called order item detail. And the business rule was there should be an order item detail for each of the quantity in the order item. So if there's an order item with a quantity of 3, there should be 3 order item details associated with that. And the reason for that was that we needed to maintain the record of an order item as a line item in and of itself, but also some data related to each individual entry as a detail. And so in this example, I'm calling it engraving. So say you have 3 iPods, and you need to specify 3 engravings, even though it's 1 item. So this example, with this abstraction, you don't need to really worry about details. You can just work with items. And so You can see how I use it over here. If I build an item, give it a quantity of 2, and then engraving is just an array, and that will get set to the individual details that are managed. And in fact, in this maintain details method, the first part of it will sort of maintain those detail records automatically. So if you have quantity of 3 and you decrement it to 2, it'll chop off that last detail. When you build it, it'll build the details as necessary based on the quantity. So now onto some security issues, which I don't think are said enough, but are very important. I think there's a lot of vulnerabilities in Rails apps out there, just on this alone, for example. Attribute protection, really important. I'd say in every model you have, you should have either using attr accessible preferably or attr protected to protect your attributes. And the reason is that exploits like this are all too easy. So if we just have a user model and a user can register, you don't know they're not going to submit admin as an attribute, and they might be able to give themselves admin privileges. This is also a problem too, and this isn't seen very much with nested attributes. So to be careful with that, if you define nested attribute model, be careful, because your users can now submit that as part of the params hash to potentially create records you don't want created or destroyed. I think one reason that people don't do this enough is because it's a little quirky to work with, because in a lot of cases you want to protect the attribute in general case. But if you're an admin, you don't want to do that. You just want to, you don't care. You're trusting the input. And a cool plugin that handles this really well is Ryan Bates' Trusted Params, which will allow you to define attr accessible for attribute protection, but then you can just call on the params hash .trust under certain conditions in the controller, like if you're an admin, and that will trust that and sort of override it. You can also trust individual keys on that params hash. So this makes it a lot easier to work with, and yet it's still very secure. This is another exploit that I think is somewhat widespread, and it just relies on people being careful with using send. So be very careful with sending anything to any of your objects with anything related to user input as an argument. So in this example, looks pretty innocuous. I'm just giving it fields to show for maybe a report generation or something. And it's sort of going to dynamically go through and send that to the user. Be careful, because destroy is not an attribute. That is a method that will get run, and it will destroy your model. So this is even worse at the class level, right? So if I was doing this at the class level to maybe call a name scope, or intending to call a name scope, someone could pass in destroy all, and it would destroy all your model, or all your records for that model. So now some gotchas that people run into a lot, I think, and some of this stuff can kind of make you want to pull your hair out until you find the root cause. Be real careful with return values and callbacks. Be aware that if you return false in a callback, it will terminate the chain. And I mean, people don't attempt to do this the wrong way, but the most common case I see where this goes wrong is they just call something else in the callback as the last line. And just by the nature of it being the last line, it's going to return whatever this returns. So if that other class, maybe an external service, is returning false, it's going to terminate your chain. It might be a little difficult to diagnose that. Another issue I've run into is be careful with select clauses. So if you're pulling data from a model and you're selecting a specific subset of those columns, which can be a good idea, as you don't necessarily want all of them, especially if they're like text columns. Be careful with this, because if something you're using depends on that attribute existing, like in this example, name, and you are not returning that in the select clause, it won't just return nil. It'll raise an exception, a missing attribute error. So I'm not saying don't use select. It obviously has uses, but just be aware of that and know that that can happen. So you might, in some instances, not want to always assume a certain attribute's available. After initialize isn't used very often, and the syntax in Rails 3 is a little different, actually. But After initialize is dangerous because it is called whenever an instance of your model comes into being. So it's not just when you call user.new. If I call user.all and there's 1,000 users and I'm iterating through them, it's going to call after initialize for each and every one of those. So if you do kind of intensive things and you're after initialize, it might cause some problems. So if I'm, say for example, I were to set the default role dynamically based on this find by name member, that's obviously causing a query to be run, and you might run into some query issues as a result of this. So be real careful what you put in your after initialize method. This is probably the most common gotcha I see, and most people have read about scopes, are aware this exists, but I mean, even I do this accidentally myself. It's not thinking, and it just happens. Be very careful with using non-deterministic methods, that is to say, methods that return differently, not dependent on the arguments in scopes, or really anything in class context, because in this example, it's going to run time.zone.now when that class is loaded, which obviously is not what you want. You want it to be run when you're calling that scope. And so to do that, you need to put it in the Lambda block. Even if it doesn't accept parameters, just put it in the Lambda block, and that will cause it to be run when you invoke the scope. This is a particularly nasty problem because this often does not appear in development. And the reason is that by default, Rails will not cache classes in development. Right? So in development mode, this is going to be reloaded every time, and you may not notice the problem. It might look fine to you. And then in production, it can be really hard to diagnose because kind of weird issues will come up. And that's it. So if there's any questions or comments, or like I said, if you have any techniques you want to share, either now or after the meeting to talk about, I'd love to hear about techniques. So anybody? Yeah. Right. I don't have an example. I don't know exactly what it does. I've heard that there's some examples. For example, if you're rather than doing the include, if you're extending it on an individual object, that might cause problems with the former technique. The active support concern resolves that. It also, I think, helps out if you are doing sort of double inclusion. Like if you're including a module in another module, which is getting included in another module, and you've got like the same method name, I think it handles some cases with that. So I'm not sure exactly, but I've read an article on it, and there are some things that it does to avoid some of these problems. Yeah, John. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure in Rails 3, well, you can use it that way. I shouldn't say it's different. You can still use it that way. But in Rails 3, you can also do after initializing and give it a symbol to a method, which in Rails 2 they removed because of performance problems, because it's being called every time. So in Rails 2, you have to actually define a method after initialize. You can't just give it like a symbol, like a normal callback. But in Rails 3, I think you can use it like a callback with a symbol. It's a minor difference. But. Oh, it might be. Yeah, yeah. Right. Right. Like if you define before save, you mean? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Next time. Well. Oh, right. So in what I said was that in Rails 3, the callbacks are all going to be class methods, not instance methods anymore. You can still do it in Rails 3.0, but it's deprecated, and it's going away in 3.1.
Right.
Just for the tape.
Cool. Yeah. Why don't you get the mic? Yeah.
Got it. Are there any implications to overriding model name?
None that I found. No. Model name is used, like I said, it's used when it builds that URL. So I haven't found any problems with that. I'm using that pretty extensively in examples like I gave to match up my resource naming with what might be different model naming. I found that technique online somewhere, and because before that I used to just kind of run into those issues and and change all my forms and just use the URL form, it's kind of, well, you got to override it. And that also has the problem of, now you have to define it different. If you do that, you have to define it differently for new and edit, right? But with that nice polymorphic path format, it will do the right thing for you. So you can define it one way for both forms. Anyone else? Cool.